Welcome, Tarun, and it's great to speak to you today. So I just finished reading Tarun's book this morning, I must confess, though I had hoped to read it much earlier. And as Ravi mentioned, the title of the book is Leadership to Last, How to Leave Great Legacies Behind. And it's basically woven around a whole lot of interviews that Harvard Business School has done with leaders in different emerging markets. And they have pulled out portions of those interviews and strung them together in a very kind of instructive way. But I'm not going to steal the thunder from Tarun. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask him a few questions around the book. And in the process, we'll also understand a little more about what the book is about. So Tarun, maybe you could just first tell us a little bit about your bigger project, the project under which you have recorded all these interviews, and then maybe about why you wrote the book.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to see this center. I have long ties to Bangalore, and it's really nice to see this place exist. Rishi asked about the broader project. The broader project is called Creating Emerging Markets, and it's a project that came out of my own frustration as an Indian living in the United States and teaching in a business school. And teaching in the economics department at Harvard for several decades now, realizing that the go-to models of leadership and entrepreneurship and so on were primarily American, just because they were accessible. And since all my my academic and work, as well as my work as an entrepreneur, has been entirely in developing countries, including and specifically India, I'm certainly aware of a number of very impressive people who have built amazing organizations in every single country in the world. And the only reason these aren't discussed, in my view, is that they're not accessible to people. So that was the genesis of the project, is to say that, you know, any good social scientist knows that you learn from variation in the data. You know, I'm trying to think of a facetious example. Let's say that I was you know, many decades and centuries ago, I decided that I wanted to study animals, suppose. And all I looked at were dogs. I would conclude erroneously that all animals bark. And that would be purely a consequence of inappropriate sampling, right? So in effect, that's what we're doing in management institutions. We are sampling on a very restricted subset of the population. I would even say a vanishingly small subset of the population. And that's just fundamentally flawed. So Jeff is a very distinguished historian who we were lucky to attract to Harvard from England 2 decades ago. And he and I thought that maybe the thing to do is to make it easier for people to access these stories. And since he and I travel a lot and had the good fortune of having lots of friends in different countries, we initiated this project where we asked what I would describe as iconic leaders in different developing countries. Would you sit down with us, just spend an hour, and tell us about your lessons over the arc of your career? So by definition, it would be people who had been in the business world, if you will, or not just business, even in the nonprofit world, but building organizations that the median citizen in that country would say, wow, that's a great thing. We're so proud of that organization. Notice that by design, it's not necessarily, you know, a for-profit entity. So there are lots of nonprofits in the book that have been around for decades and decades, and companies that have been around more than a century. So that was the sampling criterion, and the idea was to sit down with them and have a no-holds-barred 1 hour to 2 hour conversation with them, all videoed. And the expectation was that this would be a public good for the world, that we would simply make these available for free to anyone who wanted them for teaching and research purposes. So this archive exists. It's frankly unbelievable. These are people who don't talk to anybody, and they're all on the website, so please use them. Please tell other people about them. The only reason we wrote this book is to direct people to it, and we've got 2, 3 other versions coming out, one for Latin America, one for Africa, essentially just profiling people. So that's the genesis of the project.
So how did you choose what material to include in this book? Because you have, I mean, so many interviews and all that video stuff out there.
You know, the honest answer is somewhat arbitrarily. It was really more looking at hundreds of hours of original video, of which we have, transcripts and so on. And we thought we would organize it thematically as to things that you would encounter in many emerging markets, many developing countries. Combating corruption, dealing with family dynamics, trying to innovate when the ambient infrastructure is not particularly salubrious for doing innovation, all sorts of stuff. Promoting gender diversity. Many of the developing countries don't particularly do right by women at all, including ours, it must be said here. And yet there are plenty of people who have focused on that as part of building iconic enterprises that are very profitable and very successful and very socially useful. So we picked, 6 or 7 themes that I think basically every country would agree are salient issues. And within each of those themes, we just looked through our archives. To be honest, I didn't. We had an army of people who do these things. And they selected excerpts for us. And then the task for Jeff and myself was to stitch them together into a narrative of some sort. So what you see in the book is basically, stories straight from the proverbial horses' mouths, with very light editing for grammatical consistency, and then introductory essays that Jeff and I have written. In the case of India, like this particular book has mostly Indian stories. I would say, Rishi, I don't know, 60% are Indian stories, 20% are other South Asian stories, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, Pakistani stories, because there's some commonality in these societies. And then 20% are just interesting stories that we drew from Brazil, South Africa, Philippines, different developing countries, because we thought that something thematically resonated with it. When we do the Latin American book, it'll be primarily Latin American, and we'll draw on other places in different ways. But even for the Indian one, we could the repertoire is already so rich. By the way, this is a database that keeps expanding, right? So now people know about it and they approach us and say, "We'd love to be interviewed." And of course, we're not interested in responding to solicitations. Our sampling criterion is, almost will the panwala on the street say, "Haan, ye to bahut acha," very nice organization. So if it doesn't meet the smell test, we're not interested in profiling the persons.
So, what do you think is the most important legacy that a leader can leave behind? Because your book is titled "How to Leave Great Legacies Behind." So I was just wondering, from all the
so
interviews
let me say a word. Ravi started by saying, that I said building a unicorn is easy. I don't think I said that. I've been involved in the building of maybe 4 unicorns now, in a fairly significant role, and I would not characterize any of them as easy. So that's not the intent. My intent, and I actually have no issue with unicorns. I'm not here to beat up on unicorns. They clearly do something that fits the product need at that time and finds a market. And more power to those who can do it. Those of us who've been lucky enough to pull one of these off. But really, this is a much harder task. To do something that society respects as very useful, whether the respect is manifest in the form of profits, or it's manifest in the form of social change. It's a fiendishly difficult task. So here's a statistical response to Ravi's sort of humorous statement at the beginning that unicorns don't last. Most of them die out. They kind of cross this arbitrary threshold that we set, and then they fade out. And that's true throughout history. It's nothing new. I mean, the statistical half-life of a company that's successful is pretty low. The more competitive the market, the shorter is the half-life of the company. By sampling criterion, everything in this organization has lasted many, many, many decades, and sometimes centuries. I think the longest one probably is 2 centuries old and very thriving. It's a Filipino company that's a very close friend of mine. So it's a tougher task. By the way, many of them happen to be gazillion unicorns big, but that's incidental. And many of them are nonprofits. So Seva is in the book, for instance. Ella Bhatt and her stories. There's a lovely woman in Lahore, Seema Aziz, who's done just some superb work with young girls in a very conservative society. And perhaps my favorite story is Abed Bhai is a Bangladeshi activist. He used to be this. Sadly, he passed away recently, but I consider him a mentor to me. He's an amazing story. He was, Oxbridge educated, CEO of Shell, petroleum company in this part of the world when Bangladesh was formed in the civil war that split Pakistan and coincided with a massive cyclone. And he just kind of rolled out of bed and said, "What am I doing? I need to be fixing all these problems," and started this thing called BRAC, which is not a nice sounding acronym. Originally stood for Bangladesh Bangladesh Rehabilitation Action Corp. Essentially, it's the world's biggest nonprofit, right? Like the biggest, hands down. It's in 20 countries. It's got billions of dollars of budget a year. It's probably the only global NGO from the so-called global south that's originated in a developing country. And here's the clincher. It's entirely self-sufficient. It doesn't rely on philanthropy because it does a mixture of things. Like if you go to any country that operates, they have superbly run retail chains and superbly run microfinance companies that are very profitable, but all the money is plowed back into things that don't generate revenue. For instance, they would do something. What's an example? They would do something like, we have a lot of migrants from our part of the world going to the Gulf countries, and generally they're abused. That's a broad brush characterization, but I think it's fair. And they have no recourse to, if they're mistreated. So BRAC is their recourse if you're from Bangladesh, that they will give free legal aid. So that kind of stuff doesn't generate any money. But the reason they're able to do it and at scale with millions and millions of people is that they have other things that are running money. By the way, no other global NGO is self-sufficient. Right? So now that's a classy outfit, right? When you're in 20 countries, you're practically the parallel government behind the scenes. You're not asking for any glory. You're just getting up and doing the work, using sort of, frankly, market principles and business principles to do something very good for those societies. That my hat's off to them, right? Unicorn Ravi, easy. I've done 6 now, no problem compared to that. Right? So relatively speaking,
So I was just wondering how the leadership challenges are different if you're a sort of inheritor and there've already been generations of leaders before you. And you have several examples in your book. For example, Nalli Kupuswamy Chetty, M.V. Subbaiah, or even Sanjay Lalbhai for that matter. Mm-hmm. Compared to when you are a first-time entrepreneur, when you have, say, Devi Shetty or Kiran Majumdar or Narayan Murthy or someone like that, do you see kind of differences in the leadership challenges or in the kind of legacies they leave?
That's a good question. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, when I think back, I'm not sure that the book does a particularly good job of highlighting that particular aspect, to be completely candid. But when I think to the broader interviews from which these excerpts are drawn, and again, the interviews are accessible to anybody, so you can go click and the whole transcript shows up verbatim. It's an obvious difference, which is that the early years of each current entrepreneur are, spent trying to, find his or her own voice in some ways. One of my students, Nisa Godrej, is going through it right now, right? Because she's taken over her father Adi's from her father Adi, and she's got to find her own voice. That's natural, right? Or the TVS generation, I'm on the board of some of the TVS companies, so that generation is stepping into the previous one. So of course they're going to, that's the whole point, is that they have to reinterpret the legacy and do something good. Or Sanjay, who I did not interview and I don't know him, so I can't speak much about him directly. Or Jaime Ayala, which is, I think, the oldest entity profile in the book, the Filipino. He's, I think, the 5th or 6th or 7th generation of his company. For him, it's a traditional, land and banking type business. and he's interpreted in a very, technology-friendly way to build the biggest, phone company and the biggest, one of the bigger tech enterprises in that country. So there is a difference, whereas Kiran or Devi or any of these people, or Nandan and those guys are, just creating something from whole cloth in some ways. I think of that as harder, to create something just completely de novo. But we probably have people in the room who know more about these local Bangalore stories than I do. So they're just all old friends of mine. So, but yeah, that would be the difference. Yeah.
So I guess most theories of exceptionalism are kind of in question these days. So it's, I guess, difficult to believe that there's something exceptional about South Asia. But you have a lot of these South Asian stories in your book, and there seem to be some broad similarities in the way they manage their families, they address the values issue, you talk about combating corruption, etc. And you might remember it's maybe about 10 years ago, there was a book written by some folks from Wharton called The India Way.
Yes, Harbir Singh and these
Harbir and
people.
others.
Yes.
So they had also found some broad
Sure.
patterns in the kind of leadership you see in South Asia. So do you really think is there something exceptional about South Asia, or this is just
not exceptional?
Okay.
No, nowhere in the book do we say this is a uniquely South Asian.
No, you don't say that, but I'm just wondering.
No, just to be clear. So, I don't remember that book that you were referring to, the Wharton book, to the extent that it said, I think I endorsed the book, but I can't remember. But to the extent that it said that it's something unique, I don't know, I would contest that. But let me explain what my view on this is, having spent time in many developing countries. I do think there is something qualitatively different behind building, something that lasts in, let's say, the US context versus the Indian context, since we're sitting in Bangalore. And that is that, like in most developing countries, I think about, my students and colleagues who are building enterprises in Nigeria, South Africa, Bolivia, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on. In these countries, we don't have the luxury of support systems. Right? So you mentioned Devi. Devi, what does Devi want to be? And we have a pediatrician in the room, but Devi wants to be a pediatric cardiac surgeon, right? That's really what he wants to get up and do. But to do that at scale, to do something the way that he imagined in the early years, it was not possible to do it because the scale was not possible to bring. Of course, the demand existed, as we all know. You can look and see how many people are underserved for cardiac care. But he had to, basically, his team had to incur all the, infrastructural investments, right, to allow the scale to show up at the hospital in the first instance, whether it's telemedicine or health insurance or logistical services or ancillary support services and so on. See, in the US, I'm dramatizing the difference to make it black and white for rhetorical effect. But in the US, you'd have all these things pre-existing. So to that extent, I think there's something different between developing countries and kind of more mature institutional systems at that level. But I would not say that it's uniquely South Asian. There are many commonalities between Chile and Bangladesh and Kenya, for instance, that have more to do with these infrastructural limitations. That's the way I think about it anyway.
Yeah, just to take a slight diversion away from your book, but just to pursue this theme a little more.
Sure.
Just wondering, we've seen in recent times many people from South Asia becoming CEOs of global corporations.
Yes.
Just a few days ago, we saw Raj Subramaniam
FedEx,
being appointed at FedEx. We had Leena Nair at Chanel just a little while ago.
Yes.
So I'm trying to push this point a little bit, if you don't mind.
Why
are we seeing so many South Asians getting these jobs? And many of them Indians, of course.
Well, simple answer is there's many of us. Honestly, I think that's part of the answer. But less facetiously, there's a lot of us, there's a lot of Chinese. The Chinese don't speak English, and that's a big barrier. So I think that, Occam's razor, that's the simplest answer, and probably a lot of truth to it. But if you want to refine the answer, I think part of the refined answer would be that, like in any other large Asian country, the people who, like in any country, I think if you sample on people who choose to, for whatever reason, choose to leave their country and go somewhere else, they tend to be leaning towards the risk-loving side of the distribution. Okay, that's been documented over and over again for centuries. That migrants tend to be less risk-averse than those who don't migrate. It's just true. It's not an Indian characteristic. It's just true. So that's a particular subset of the population. So I don't think it's a statement on Indians writ large. It's a statement on the particular subset that chose to migrate. That's one point. Second point is that I think particularly at the skill level, as opposed to unskilled migration, those who choose to migrate have gone through a pretty draconian, examination, hazing in our system, or we used to call it ragging. I don't know if we still call it that, but basically just draconian process of selection and so on. So again, you're sampling on a very particular population. So I think it's inappropriate, and that's true of the Koreans and the Chinese and other large populous countries also. But I think we have to be careful about comparing that tiny, risk-loving fraction that have been selected by the academic, gauntlet to average Americans, where it's the whole population. Those are some observations. But in the main, I think there's a lot of us, and there's a lot of Indian CEOs, but there's a lot of Indians. So I don't know what to make of it. So.
Because there
are lots of people who have these fancy theories about this. I don't buy any of them. I mean, there's no evidence.
I did read a book called The Made in India Manager, which essentially was partly picking up the point you just mentioned about how people go through this really challenging process, overcoming all the odds in India. But they also spoke about a few other things like the aspiration of the Indian middle class, exposure to global media, the diversity that we naturally have in India. And all of these as kind of good preparatory grounds for people to go into those global positions.
I mean, Ravi, Rishi, I think there's a grain of truth in all those. The question is, what really accounts for most of the variation in the phenomenon. And I don't believe that those things are that salient. I'll give an example. I run a global charity called Aspire, which is targeted at first-generation students in any country in the world, right? So we operate in 150 countries, so essentially everywhere on the face of the earth. And we're looking for young adults, 18 to 26 years old, who are in college somewhere, typically in no-name colleges anywhere, right? And ask them to apply to our entirely free program, which is funded by a few of us. And if they go through our tests and they do well, then we give them access to free resources of all sorts, online courses, certificates that normally cost a lot of money if they make it, one-on-one webinars with leading faculty from around the world, just a lot of stuff. And in that context, so we get, tens of thousands of applications every year, right? And so we see kids from Yemen, we see kids from the Rohingya community, we see from inner Congo, we see Indians, Bangladeshis, Brazilians. I can't tell any difference. They are, if they make it through that our free project and so on, and they take the time, they show that resilience and that intention to compete, there's no difference. I don't see any difference. I can't tell. We even try to measure some of the differences because we get tens of thousands of people coming through. There's nothing. Yeah. So I don't buy whatever that book is, to the extent that it's saying there's something unique. I think you can explain most of it by some pretty simple structural things. And like any good scholar, you should try to go to the simplest explanation first before you just randomly complicate things. Anyway, that's my philosophy anyway. So.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of your earlier books. I want to go back to the book you wrote called Billions of Entrepreneurs, where you looked at the evolution of entrepreneurship in China and India, and particularly looked at how different factors have influenced the evolution of entrepreneurship there. So I was just wondering whether you have any current thoughts on that, because going back to the question that Ravi was asking about unicorns and how the way we see startups evolving today. We've had, I think, about the latest count I saw was about 94 unicorns out of India and still counting. And these unicorns don't look all that different from the unicorns elsewhere in the world, at least the way I look at them.
I agree.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, whatever
Yeah.
You saw the differences you saw between Chinese and Indian entrepreneurship in your book.
Yeah.
Do you see some of those differences kind of narrowing now? And could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I did not say that the entrepreneurs are different in that book. In fact, whenever anybody, so that book got a lot of publicity when it came out for a few years after. Maybe it was one of the early books on this comparison and so on, or it just came at the right time. But whenever I was asked what's the difference between Chinese and Indian entrepreneurs, my answer was always the one that I just gave, which is I don't see any difference. Right? The people are the same. It's like you take the same person and you put them in a different context. They behave differently because we're all human beings responding to not just our own internal compass, but the incentives and the structures in the system around us. What I was saying was that it's almost like the closest thing that we get to a country level natural experiment, right? I mean, we don't, as social scientists, we don't get to vary reagents in a test tube, but we look for quasi-natural experiments. And in the case of China and India, you had pretty interesting phenomena, which is in roughly the same time, 1949 for the People's Republic, 1947 for us. The modern nation state came into existence. They're both two large, populous, neighboring, proximate countries with extremely large populations, civilizational histories, domination by Europeans. Everything is the same. And one, for idiosyncratic reasons, Nehru et al., we went in this direction, and Mao Zedong and others went in that direction, right? So here you had a natural experiment. Everything was the same, and then suddenly you choose. So that was the reason, from a scholarly standpoint, that was the reason I was interested in it. Say, okay, that's kind of neat, because you varied one set of choices, and then you can track and see what happened. And the point of the book was to say that they've gone on different paths, not that the people were different. And I think the paths, if anything, the differences that I highlighted, particularly the role of the state, I think I stand by most of it. I think it's been accentuated, particularly under Xi Jinping. It's been totally accentuated, the very tight control of the state on enterprise. You've seen it with the crackdown on the tech companies in the last few months. And you see it, with my students in China. So I built a software company that had a Beijing and a Delhi office. Don't have it anymore. We sold it. And so I had first-hand look of how the software company worked there. And I've been on boards where we have Chinese and Indian operations. The main difference is not the managers or the entrepreneurs. It's the way in which you relate to the state and what the state does and the attitude of the state. I mean, to put it simply, in China, you can't be big without being in bed with the state. And in India, you can't be big by being in bed with the state. So it's, you've got to stay away, essentially, to make it big in some ways. Anyway, so those are the differences, but not the nature of the entrepreneur themselves. Yeah.
So I was also wondering, just to sort of close the loop and come back to where we started, I was just wondering, many of the leaders whose interviews you have in the book, they're very thoughtful people. You can just see the way they have thought about all the different issues like values, culture, what kind of impact they will make, and so on. And they seem quite a contrast to the sort of brash, impatient image we have of a, say, typical unicorn entrepreneur anywhere in the world. So I was just wondering, this is just crystal ball gazing, but the next generation of Indian enterprises, particularly those that might come out of all these, unicorn type experiments.
Yeah.
Would you expect them to sort of, figure in a, let's say, a video that's done 20 years down the...
Yeah. So, as I say, first of all, statistically, most of these unicorns won't last.
Sure.
Write it down. They will not last. That's just true. We've seen that decade after decade, country after country, over the last century, is that the half-life is not that great. That doesn't mean they're not successes. They accomplished something, they deserve a lot of credit. The entrepreneur deserves to get rich if he or she, that's what they wanted most. Hats off to them. It's not an easy thing to do, but they will not last. That's the first thing. On the first point that you were talking about, which is sort of the humility and the demeanor, I do think there's something there, but that is purely a conjecture on my part. There's no hard data behind it. It is quite striking. So, in the preface, Jeff and I wrote, if I can't remember the exact sentence, but we wrote that because some people always ask us, what's common across all this? And I wrote three things. It's audacity of intent. Okay, the idea is to create something meaningful on the world stage. Humility of demeanour, and steadfastness of purpose. So they're humble, they're steady, and they have insanely large ambitions. And those are three characteristics that I see over and over again. Now, it's not to say that somebody got up one day and said, I'm going to create an insanely great organization. Most didn't. Some started off thinking that they could, right? Like I was there at the beginning when Devi started. Right? And I remember the very first conversations with Devi when Kiran introduced me to him was, we can fix healthcare for the world. So in that case, you can say maybe the person had, I don't know, some vision, some hubris, a little bit of both to say this is what we want to do, or some, moral quest. But in most cases, people kind of stumbled onto it. Like Abid Bhai, the BRAC person I was speaking about, he didn't get up. He just got up and said, how can I be a fat cat, cigar smoking, multinational executive when my country's falling apart and people are dying on the street? There seems something to be morally repugnant about it. So I'm going to do, what I can do today. And it grew into, oh my goodness, this is like a real thing. And this could really, empower people. It's kind of cliche to say it this way, but I think he really made it real. This can empower people to solve their own problems and get out of poverty, right? And it's worked, for tens of millions of people, which is pretty awesome.
So you seem to be placing quite a bit of value on longevity. So I'm just wondering, why do you think longevity is that important?
So that's a very good question. I don't think it's per se more important than, so let me talk, with my economist hat on. So those who have a background in economics, I'll put on my hat as a general equilibrium economist, right? Nothing particularly enticing about longevity. I mean, if you had a system where people, used society's resources, created a successful organization, and then when the time was past, the forces of competition or societal progress or whatever caused it to vanish and a new set of people emerged from it, nothing wrong with that. That could be perfectly consistent with society moving forward. If anything, excessive longevity is probably inimical to societal health, right? So you got plenty of dinosaurs floating around who are blocking progress by not growing. So the intent here is not to say that longevity is per se desirable. It's just to say that that it's interesting that some people have created organizations that are almost by universal acclaim, seen to be consistently doing good decade after decade after decade, and have defied the statistical odds of vanishing into the dust. But the claim is not that longevity is per se good. And the reason we focus on this is just because it's a way to leverage the project, to put it in a very mechanical way, but also because, the press generally tends to glorify the unicorn. And I said, bas ho gaya, that's enough. Now let's look at the other side, which is, to my mind, as I say, infinitely harder. Yeah. It's like doing a unicorn every year for a generation. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll come to my last question before I throw it open. So I was just wondering, both of us are business professors.
Yes.
And, I've read the Harvard Business School's mission. I've looked at, what Harvard is trying to do. I'm also quite familiar with what my own institution is trying to do. And we all make claims towards building leaders and leadership and all the rest. So, based on all the interviews and all the stuff in your book, is there anything we could do as business schools to promote the kind of leadership which is being espoused by many of these people who are prominently featured in your book?
I think to me it's a huge. So the motto of Harvard Business School, since Rishi mentioned it, is to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. That's the formal motto. And I've been at Harvard a very long time. I'm a student there. I've been there ever since. So I'm implicated in the good and bad of the institution. What I would say is we fall short. quite a bit short, actually. And with full honesty, I am a vocal critic in our system of this, with full transparency, hopefully constructive critic, right? My view is that we're very successful in putting out people who succeed, first of all, right? Disproportionately succeed, partly because we get amazing people coming, and then partly because I think we give them a good experience, and I think it's generally positive. We have some Harvard alums in the room. They can validate or contest my statement. But we don't nearly do enough to enable them to really help others to reach their potential, right? So in other words, you would like, if you really want to make a difference in the world, not only should you transform these very tiny percentage of people who pass through our institutions, but you should, there should be a trickle down, right? That the effect of, organizationally touching these people should trickle down to the masses. There should be a multiplier effect. I don't see any evidence of the multiplier when I look at the broad data, right? What I see is, what we all see is rising inequality everywhere, dramatically rising inequality. So if anything, those of us who are lucky enough to go to a good institution, whether it's IIM or Harvard or whatever, pick your institution, Sciences Po in Paris, Hitotsubashi in Japan, whatever, they generally disproportionately do well, and others are behind, So we don't. So I think what we should take away from these is that part of building an institution that lasts and that is seen by the person on the street as, wow, that's something, right? Is that we have to explicitly focus on this aspect of disseminating the whatever, largesse society has been kind enough to give to us. And I think that's what these characters do better than the average unicorn type of character.
Just to push you a little bit on that. So what could we do differently in business education, do you think? Is there anything we could do to achieve this larger effect that you're just speaking about?
So, so I don't know the answer to that, but I do, in my own very tiny limited capacity, I'm running a lot of experiments to answer that, okay? So an experiment that I just ran, because in COVID we were all stuck in our backyards I was sitting in my Boston backyard for months on end, we were doing everything on Zoom. And so a couple of us proposed a project to Harvard, which was very heavily resisted as not fitting the traditional DNA, but being sort of, in Hindi we would say besharam, we decided we would do it and then apologize. So here's the experiment that we did. We took one of these MOOCs. I don't know if people are familiar with these MOOCs, these free online courses, massive open online course, MOOC. We took a course that I had developed called Entrepreneurship in Emerging Economies, which is one of Harvard's most popular courses. It's like 1 million people have done it across a couple hundred countries. And we said, let's make this, and people would always ask us, can you take this MOOC, which is a 6-week course where you essentially go through 6 topics about being an entrepreneur in a developing country. Okay, not particular to India. I think the examples are from all over. And so each week you spend like 6-7 hours going through that content, some questions, some video snippets, some reading, this, that. It's quite engaging. It's popular. But it's at a very general level. And so people will call us and say, like healthcare people will call and say, can you do the same thing with healthcare? Somebody would say, can you do the same thing for Brazil? Because we would love to have a Brazil course. And I said, no, definitely not. I can't do it because it takes a lot of time to shoot these videos. But the experiment that we ran was, can we not take this and customize it to a population in the following way? We would asynchronously ask the students to view the existing course, which is very general. And then on the weekend, synchronously, we would run 3 hours of Zoom sessions, right? Customizing it to whatever that affinity group was, right? So in our case, I said, let's do it with Africa. Because we'd always get these solicitations from Africa saying, we have African entrepreneurs, we can't afford to go to the US institution. The MOOC is great, but it is not really about Africa. So what can we do? So we put it out there and said, okay, you don't need to come to Harvard and pay insane amounts of money, but you can do this asynchronous MOOC on your own time in the week, and on the weekend we'll do customized content for Africa, okay, to illustrate that week's themes, but with Africa-specific flavor, nuance. But we will do it for 1,000 students at a time. Right? So there'll be 1,000 students on Zoom, and we'll create an engaging experience, and it'll be interactive. And people said, "This is insane. 1,000 students, how are we going to do it?" We did it. It has extremely high favorability, and the way we did it was, and I'll tell you why I'm using this example to answer your question. The way we did it was we had the interactive discussion, but we had a series of algorithms programmed in the background to vary the pedagogical tenor so that people were not just frozen there, 1,000 people on Zoom looking at each other like little tiles on a checkerboard, but they were being paired in the background as, why don't you do this little side discussion demographically, why don't you from that country in Africa match up with this country and talk about this and post the answer. And there were a bunch of bots running in the background to manage this interaction. And, probably in a 3-hour session, out of the 1,000 people, actually, no, we did it for 700, not 1,000. We started with the idea of 1,000, but we ended up with 700. After 700 people in any 3-hour session, 200 would participate, So they really felt engaged. And the whole thing cost almost nothing. And they paid good money for it. So overall, it was very profitable, right? So we were trying to make a point that you can vary the pedagogy and you're reaching this very mass audience, right? This is what we should do. We should be experimenting with pedagogy in a variety of ways, using a mixture of human intervention and algorithm to take the same content, customize it, mix and match, and disseminate it. So not that that's the answer, I'm just saying that's the one thing that I did and it worked really well. So now we've generalized it. We've got these foundations giving us money to say, can you do the same thing for all these other entities, right? And I want to do it with 10,000 students at one time now. It sounds insane, but I think the same thing works. The algorithms are scalable. You can find ways to create experiences. You can customize it. And that way you're taking, a pretty high level content and reaching very large audiences. It's a lot of fun. So we should all be doing things like that. Crazy things. By the way, it cost nothing. Everything I did was just from my backyard on a chair with a little bit of coding. That's it.
That sounds good. So I think the answer is we should be doing much more experimentation, trying out lots of stuff.
So, yeah.
Okay, good. So let me just open it up then. So if there are any questions or comments or anyone who would like to enter the discussion, yeah, please.
I'm Priya Naik. I'm a professor and I also teach entrepreneurship at one of the affiliate Bangalore University colleges. I have taken up that course of yours, not through MOOC, but through EDX, the course
on
entrepreneurship.
Thing. Yeah, edX is the platform, yeah.
What struck me very much was the example on BRAC. I could relate to it because you covered it extensively.
Okay.
And about Abdul Aziz, if I get the name correct.
Abid.
Abid.
Yeah.
Right. Now coming to my question, our Indian CEOs, which Rishi mentioned in the US, are doing extremely well. We have so many of them. Mm-hmm. And each time somebody is appointed, we applaud, love it. Our WhatsApp groups are simply full like crazy. Do they actually do something for India like Aziz did? Would they pass your smell test? Would they appear in your book? Do you think that they are really worth covering?
Would they appear in the book? Well, if they have not been the primary entrepreneurs who've created the organization, which in none of these cases, neither Satya nor Sundar nor any of these people, many of them are very good friends, so I have utmost respect for all of them. But no, they would not appear in the book because they haven't created any organization. They are stewards of an existing organization and are taking it. But I think that's not a commentary on, that's not an indictment of their value to society. I mean, I think they're unbelievable, these men and women who have risen to the top through the crucible of very tough competition, right? It's not easy to be the CEO of a decent sized, let alone giant corporation in America. No, they deserve every salutation. And, going back to, have they contributed to India? Not in the way that Abed Bhai did for Bangladesh and developing countries, or in the way that some others are doing here. But again, that's not an indictment. They are serving a very useful purpose. They're making us proud. I'm proud of them. And they are examples to other young people to say you can compete with the best and be as good as them. So the answer is no, they wouldn't be in the book. But then the book is written for a different purpose. So it's neither here nor there, honestly. So, yeah.
So congratulations on your book. Waiting to read it. So 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first is kind of related to startups, right? So the question really is: are we creating or are startups?
Sorry, who are you?
My name is Rohan.
Okay.
Right? And part of the confusion that I have is, are we creating bad incentives for startups? Because you hear about Bharat Pay, you hear about Better.com laying off 3,000 people on a Zoom call. And the performance of a lot of these startups seems to be correlated to the toxicity within their work environment, right? So that's question number 1, right? So why is that, and is there something that can be done about it? And the second question is, when I look at the likes of Elon Musk, eccentric innovators, fantastic, really game-changing innovations, right? But at the same time, they're reckless, right? In the sense that, they've posted reckless tweets that have warranted SEC scrutiny, and then they're given a hall pass, right? So are these crazy innovators, somehow immune to scrutiny, and, what sort of legacies are they leaving behind? So those would be my 2 questions.
So so Rohan, on the first question, I would contest the premise of the question. The premise of the question seemed to be that toxic environments are correlated with success. I don't know that there's any evidence for that. I don't know that it's not true, but my hunch is it's not true. So I don't know that I have more, another comment on it. I tend to just ignore these one-off sort of cancerous individuals. That person that you referred to, I've forgotten the particular context, was outrageously bad at just about any level at what he did. So I don't think there's anything to learn from his escapades. On the, Musk and Jobs and all these people, look, would I rather that, Musk be completely responsible, or, Bill Gates not fly off the handle in his youth when anybody kind of was not, or Steve Jobs not be unpleasant? Of course, I'd rather they be pleasant and successful. But I think we should look at the good in the people and try to learn from the good parts and not focus on the bad parts. And should they get a hall pass? No, they shouldn't get a hall pass. But by the way, Musk doesn't always get a hall pass. Remember he made that insane comment when that there was that incident when somebody was trapped under a water cave in Thailand, and he made some really egregious comment about that person. They took him to court and he settled out of court. So he doesn't always get a hall pass. And the SEC sanctioned him. Now it's a different thing that he's got insanely so much money that the sanction didn't matter. But I think the signal from society is pretty clear. So at some point he'll refer to it. But I prefer to focus on, just the creativity and the guts of these people, which I think is pretty fabulous, to create PayPal, SpaceX, now, the boring company that's digging tunnels under different places. It's pretty awesome. I aspire to such insanity myself. So that's just my view. Yeah.
Good evening. This is Govind Mirchandani here. You mentioned that great leaders leave lasting legacies behind. And I assume that these lasting legacies you're referring to are really a set of strong shared values, optimization, also flexibility, and also some kind of innovation spirit in the organization. Now, these are great leaders doing it. They're often followed by not so great leaders. So how does one institutionalize leadership to last, number one? Second, is lasting leadership all that important, or is it the flexibility to the context of the environment which ensues 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years later, which will make a big difference, and maybe the leadership pattern or style or content could change and should change according to the times?
No, I think it's a fair comment, question. Maybe one way to say it. I mean, I think of it as these leaders who've left legacies, as what they do is they create a scaffolding. Okay, and subsequent generations, to the extent that that the organizations last, which they have to be in our sample, in our book, subsequent generations reinterpret that scaffolding, right? Or build on the scaffolding differently. And that's probably the flexibility that you're alluding to, because of course societies are changing, right? So the way that Jaime Ayala in the Philippines is interpreting the Ayala family legacy, which is a gold-plated name in the Philippines, right, is very different than his grandfather and great-great-great-grandfather did, because the times are different in the Philippines, technologies are different, and that's how it should be. There should be, as you rightly put it, some central abiding value that holds things together, which I don't think are very different from location to location. They're all basically common sense things, doing societal good in a variety of ways. Some are more focused on empowering women, some are more focused on being very anti-corruption, some are more focused on charitable redistribution, which is make a lot of money in the enterprise, but make sure that it's spread across society in different ways. These are pretty common themes that you see in essentially every country. And I think that's what keeps the legacy going. And then the daughters and sons will reinterpret it in different ways. And plenty of these, I'm not going to single out anybody here, have gone through generations where interim generations are pretty mediocre. That's a fact. Not everybody is as competent as their mom or dad. So, but if the scaffolding is strong, then it lasts, and the next person can salvage it and reinterpret it.
I have one more question. This question truly is related to GE.
Uh-huh.
GE had,
Yeah.
as you know, a very strong leader, and all the legacies behind were left. But subsequently, now GE is in serious trouble.
Yeah.
He even included an internal person whom he promoted before he left to make sure that the legacies can be in continuity. But even subsequent to all that, it didn't quite work. So I'm still on that question that can you really institutionalize and carry forward? That's
No, it's a good question. Look, I'm trained as a mathematician fundamentally, so I think in algorithms and statistics. That's how what comes down to me. It's a probabilistic process. It's not that it's going to last indefinitely. Nothing lasts indefinitely. Everything is ephemeral in some ways, philosophically. But the way I would say it is that some of these lessons that we're trying to extract from these stories is to say these are things that predispose the organization to lasting longer, not that it guarantees it. So even somebody like GE has been an incredible organization, right? Over 100 years, going back to Thomas Edison and all these amazing people that have come. I think GE has done more for management than Harvard Business School, for sure. I mean, it's produced more CEOs and more senior leaders going to more organizations than anybody else. So I think we should, as humanity, salute the organization for doing very good work for 150 years or whatever the duration is. That doesn't mean it's going to be indefinite. It just means that the scaffolding was strong enough to last as long as it did. Because again, the median unicorn is going to vanish in some small number of years. So that's the benchmark. So relative to that, whatever these guys did way back when, Thomas Edison, Reginald Jones, whatever, caused there to be a structure that could be reinterpreted by the likes of Jack Welch and to some extent Jeff Immelt, even though he presided over the downfall of GE, so to speak. Yeah.
Hi, Tarun. This is Mansoor. It's nice to see you, and thank you for your time. You spoke about how it's harder building an organization that matters than really building a unicorn. My question to you is, how does a newer company, it doesn't necessarily need to be a unicorn, how does a newer company really build an organization which will eventually be a lasting legacy? And how does a newer organization really find its purpose, assuming that it lasts, of course?
So I think this is where the interviews in the book are quite instructive, because I can give you some general theory, but it's not, it's sort of, it'll come across as trite. But in the stories of the people, the men and women in the book, it's really quite cool how they are walking the talk every day, right? So they are, what's nice about the interviews in the project, not just the ones that are in the book, but in the project are, you remember these people are sort of in the latter part of their careers, right? By definition, because they built and presided over entities for decades. And they don't have anything to prove to anybody, right? So they are incredibly candid. Right? That's one of the beauties of these interviews. They are incredibly honest. You can hear Ratan Tata, I did the interview with Ratan Tata. It was fabulous conversation way over an hour, talking about all the mistakes he had made, and reflecting on them and so on. And then saying, we made this mistake, so then we tried this experiment, then we tried that. So you can see, Mansoor, in that process, how people are kind of experimenting their way to a value system, to an organizational system that works for them, to try to, and they all have, all the people in the book and in the videos have an eye on their legacy pretty early on. They are thinking, I want this to survive me. That's just who they are. So they do. Now, the counterfactual would be someone who says, and I have plenty of students who say this. I just was sitting with a couple of them in the hotel before this afternoon from Harvard, saying, yeah, I'm going to run this company and I'm going to get it to this point and then I know who to sell it to. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. I mean, honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. It's, they're doing something productive and then they're saying, I want to sell it to them, and then my creativities are best deployed by doing another one somewhere, and then another one and another one. Great. That's just not who these people are. They're interested in building scaffoldings that last. That's all. And the answer to your question is, I think they experiment their way to it, one Monday morning at a time.
Thank you for that wonderful interaction, both Mr. Tarun and Mr. Rishi. I'm a pediatrician, so maybe I'm the odd one out in this group. So I have a couple of questions after this beautiful interaction. One is, should entrepreneurship be offered to all medical students? It's a very simple question. I mean, you mentioned that there was a medical group which wanted to learn entrepreneurship.
What is entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship is basically, I think of it as, even though we're all like professors of entrepreneurship and all this, I think of it basically as creative puzzle solving, finding better solutions to something tough, right? So to the extent that we should all be looking for better solutions to tough things, I think everybody should have. By the way, the Delhi government, so one of the projects I was fortunate enough to be involved with the government of India at the government's request was to write a policy for entrepreneurship in India, just a policy paper, which led to something called Atal Innovation Mission, which in turn led to, which is an outfit in Niti Aayog in Delhi. And that in turn has, among many things, it's led to a very nice experiment that's running. This is a tangential response to your question, so please bear with me for a second. What it's led to is these things called tinkering labs, okay? Which are basically, there's 10,000 of them in the country now, and the plan is to go to 50,000 or 70,000. But these are little workspaces that are equipped with some pretty unbelievable gadgetry in poor schools, rich schools, all kinds of schools. And the kids play with it. High school kids, 9 to 12 standard, they play with it. So they still go to, memorize things like I did in high school here for physics and chemistry. But they also get to play with it and really learn science with their hands. And there was a guy at Institute of Science yesterday who was telling me that he has managed to convince the Delhi government, and I think 2-3 other state governments, to mandate 2 hours in a week class time, right, to receive some instruction on entrepreneurship to pair with the playing in the labs. So I think there we're running an experiment, right? So we can measure that and say, some years out, did you see any results from that? But I think creativity people should be, I don't know whether I would say you necessarily have to be taught entrepreneurship, but there should be room for you to play in every profession, right? And you know better than I do. So I'm the black sheep in my family. Everybody is a surgeon or a doctor or something, and I'm the only one who's not. So But in our family, I always say that, the medical education, at least in the US, is done all wrong because it's all about, now it's changing, by the way. I don't know what it is here, but at Harvard Medical School, it's 4 years, right? The 4 years, your basic medical degree. We call it MBBS here, we call it MD there. First 2 years are rigid, and the last 2 years are full of electives, and including electives where the doctors have to go to a place like the Museum of Fine Arts, which is one of America's finest museums in Boston, and basically interact with people and look at a painting, right? And say, what are you seeing in the painting? Or what are you seeing in this sculpture? And engage with other people. And what they're trying to teach people is about picking up on clues, patient bedside engagement, right? And obviously they're sacrificing some formal instruction on how the kidney works or some new, harnessing the immune system to tackle cancers or pediatric oncology or something. Something is being given up. But the trade-off that the profession seems to be going in, at least in my corner of the world, is it's better to come up with general principles of problem solving and creativity and empathy for the doctor than to fill every single last detail in his head, which any case there's no space to get everything. As you know, the literature is exploding. So sorry, long answer to saying yes, we should teach.
No, next question would be, would the Indian management group want to start such a program for our medical students in India?
So, by the way, we, at least at Harvard, we have a lot of programs for doctors. We have tons of programs. I have a lot of my students are, heads of surgery and in the different Boston hospitals and, Eastern Seaboard hospitals. We have a lot of programs where medical doctors come and, implicitly they force us to adapt whatever, gyan we are giving to them in their own language. And it's a lot of fun. So, and I think they really enjoy it. So,
thank you.
So I hope Rishi will do it.
Yeah, I have. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think we already do quite a bit with engineering students, but I'm not sure we do so much with medical students. But I suspect the challenge is more what Tarun was alluding to, that the medical curriculum already is pretty intense in India. I'm not sure how it's structured, but it doesn't look like there are too many of them who are looking or have the time for that kind of thing. But I'm sure we'd love to do it. We do run several management programs now for the doctors as well as the healthcare industry. And innovation and entrepreneurship is a pretty significant component of those programs that we run. So extending that to medical students shouldn't be too difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, but just to reiterate what I was saying, at least at Harvard, and I think most of the leading American medical schools, they've basically given up on the idea of saying that we've got to put all this content, that they must do it. They say, okay, here are the basics. Then after that, anyway, you will go to Uncle Google and check. Or you go to, medical directory. I mean, which doctor doesn't? I mean, every day I see all the surgeons in my family, they're looking up, stuff on their hand phone, what to do now, right? Or calling each other, as it should be. So, and anyway, the amount of knowledge is exploding so fast. Who's going to keep up with this? So why bother trying to ram everything into your head? Just get the basics and then get the real kind of soft skills and the problem-solving skills and the collaboration skills. And I think that stands you. So I think you should take the lead on that.
Thank you. The second question I had is a little more contentious. Standing outside, the vast differences in business ethics in different countries and within the country, in our country itself. If you look at different organizations, they have such variety of ethical ways in which they work. So, any comments on that?
I love the phrase, variety of ethical ways. I think he's trying to say most people are unethical. So but he's more polite than I am. Look, I mean, I have a practical side to me. I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm not, I'm not foolish to say that. I wish I could say that it doesn't pay to be unethical, but I think there are plenty of unethical people who are making a lot of money. So that would not be a, statistically defensible statement in India or in most developing countries. Lots of corrupt people who survive and do well. The more, milder claim that I would make is that it's certainly possible to be very honest and do very well financially, right? Certainly possible. Ample examples of that over and over again, every country, including the most corrupt, right? By the way, India features quite poorly on the corruption list, and we have plenty of ethical people here. So that's what I choose to focus on.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you.
Hi, my name's Amit. I had one simple question. You mentioned that a lot of the interviews are available online as a public good. Where could we find these?
So if you just go to Uncle Google and say HBS Creating Emerging Markets Project.
Creating Emerging Markets Project.
Creating Emerging Markets Project. I guess we should just put it up there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So that was a simple one.
Yeah.
The second one's more complex, and it's good to have both of you on stage because there's an Indian and US twist to this. When I look at most of the, not just unicorns, but a lot of the emerging companies today, they're fundamentally digital companies. And the nature of work is changing so dramatically. And I think there was this great article a few years back about when your manager is an algorithm. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of businesses in India as well as across the world. When I look at B-school education, and I'm a victim myself, it seems that a lot of the education has been tailored to the command and control, G kind of structures. I'm outdated, but I'm wondering whether business school today is equipped for teaching young kids about how to build digital businesses, marrying the thought process of algorithms, AI, and actual management thinking, the kind of ethics that may entail. Literally any MBA student I speak to today laughs at the concept of NPV and cash flow when valuations, are, and nobody has a clue how those work. And I'm just curious to hear how you see management education addressing all of these things.
Rishi, you want to go first?
I think we recognize that some of these changes are happening. For example, just this last year, we did a MBA curriculum review, and some of the points you were making did come out in that review. So now the bigger question is how we address that, and I think that's work in progress as of now. So we do have faculty members who are focused on some of the things you speak about, but then if you really need to make a difference to the students, it has to happen sort of horizontally, which is much more difficult. But I think the good news is that the conversations have started. I think faculty have realized that there are some big changes happening, and that needs to come into the curriculum, the way we teach, the kind of cases we do, and things like that. But at the same time, I think the flip side is that if you listen to the videos or you read the book that Tarun has written, I think some of the management principles have been pretty invariant over time. So what is it that needs to remain the same and what is it that needs to change? I think that's the question which we'll need to look at closely.
So I'd agree with what Rishi is saying. Just let me augment with a few things. I do think there is a need for, let me speak about my own institution, Harvard, for a second. There's absolutely a need to have more digitally competent faculty, to put it bluntly. And a need, this is my personal view, this is not an institutional view, I'm just giving my personal view, and a need to, like in our case, we have a 100-year tradition of being wedded to the case study, and it's worked beautifully for us, right? Continues to work beautifully for us, but there's no reason why that should be the only method of inquiry, right? In fact, I've just launched something within a broader construct at Harvard called a Tech for All Lab. And I had a chance to speak to some of my friends at ISC yesterday about it, where the whole premise is to use digitization and algorithms to solve big social problems, right? So by the very nature, that lab is going to have a lot of postdocs and data-centric algorithm people. And just personalizing it, I'm an algorithm person, but I'm very happy with the case study approach also. So there's no reason why you can't do both and use whatever tool is appropriate to a particular situation. That's one comment. The other comment I'll make is, I'm sure your statement is correct that most of the unicorns are, digital natives, if you will. That's almost. But I think that's also an issue. Locally, we started a bunch of friends, and I started incubator sort of called Excelor in somewhere here, JP Nagar. Chris and Shibu and a couple other people. And part of the starting intent was, we really should move beyond IT. We should try to create an ecosystem so that we can create amazing companies in agriculture and medicine and this and that. And I have to say, the entity has been very successful. But on that dimension, we're a lot slower than I would like. But I've been lucky to be part of a team that just took a company public on NASDAQ called Fluence, which is a mega unicorn, if you will. And it's the world's first grid-level battery storage system to stabilize renewables. Right? So if you have wind and solar power, it comes very erratically, and to make it be a part of the grid, you can't only have wind blowing at night and sun in the morning. So you need battery systems that are 2 times the size of this auditorium to plug into the grid. So that's what we do. So it's not there is digitization, but it's primarily an energy system. Another great example is a student of mine has built another mega unicorn in Nigeria, which is basically applying basic management principles to corn farming, maize farming. Has nothing to do with digitization and so on. So it's possible to do with others. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I, in the main, I think yes, business schools like any other entity have to adapt, right? To be relevant. And I actually think there's another adaptation that we are lagging in. I don't know if Rishi would share that assessment. Not enough of our faculty are science literate, to put it bluntly.
Or digitally.
Digital is a subset of science literate. But, look, the revolution in the next 30 years is in the life sciences, right? And in India, we're way behind on that. But if I look at what's a good example? Okay, so you've all heard of Moore's law, right? The pace of computing power change. So the rate at which genome sequencing is advancing is far faster than Moore's law, far faster, right? Like exponentially faster. So think about that. Moore's law drove everything that you're seeing in the digital ecosystem, right, centered in Silicon Valley. Now our understanding of the human genome is progressing so much faster. Everything around here can be made by biology. This can be made by biology, this is biology. We can make it with basically taking a sequence of a genome, injecting it into a biological factory called a yeast, and out pops everything. Yeah. How many of our faculty understand that? I think a vanishingly small percentage will understand it. So we have to, I think in business schools, I think broaden our lens aperture to get different skill profiles in to be meaningful. So that's my view anyway.
Thank you.
I think we should take the last question maybe. Yeah, sure.
My name is Mani. I'm a retail designer qualified from the United States. My question is, would you know the proportion of the number of leaders and then the large companies, which is with legacy behind, who have been qualified from the premium management institutes in the world, versus outside of that? For example, Nalli Kupaswamy, or the gentleman who is an entrepreneur who made sanitary napkins and stuff like this. Which outnumbers the other, or which is proportionately larger than the other?
Well, that's easy. Very few people come from elite, man. Very few.
People come from?
The fancy business schools.
Okay.
That's easy answer.
So on that sobering note, let me thank Tarun for a good and very interesting conversation, and thanks all of you for being here. Ravi, you any last word? Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody.